Homes and Places last week or the week before, where we had a really animated debate around green retrofit and seizing the day in terms of that opportunity that we have to really think about how we live, work, rest and play as we emerge from the pandemic. Today, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about why we're here. We're talking about devolution. Greater Manchester, of course, does have an elected Metro Mayor, and we do have powers and ambitions to do things differently. We are in the process of listening or having a consultation on Places for Everyone, which is the new framework from Paul Dennett, who will join us for the final session that we're holding in this series. But of course, the series comes from our findings last year and our action plan for what needs to be done. And in that, one of our actions to really actually build back better was deliver more devolved powers to meet housing need and scale up housing delivery. The promised Devo white paper, which, as you know, has not materialised, but we do have something called a levelling up white paper, must work to level up and give powers, including local discretion on right to buy and multi-year funding for affordable housing, similar to those granted to Greater London. This would help unlock innovation and investment and would work to build back better homes and places for Greater Manchester. So today is really building on that sort of action point and recommendation in the absence of any white paper on devolution, but to really have that discussion and try and frame and shape the debate in Greater Manchester about the need for more powers and perhaps more investment and more funding to sort of really level up. And level up actually seems to be in every sentence that I say these days. So with that, so yeah, and I think remembering that the Great Homes for Greater Manchester is about lobbying and influencing and shaping that agenda. So everybody on the call today, let's come together. We bring together developers, providers, planners, house builders to that voice to sort of say, well, it's not just one sector or another. Greater Manchester's got a proud history of collaboration, and working together and working in partnership. It's never been more important for us to work together through this pandemic and get us back working, living, resting and playing in the way we want to in a healthier environment. As always, I'm very grateful to our sponsors and supporters, of which there are many, but in particular the Greater Manchester Housing Providers, Anthony Collins and the Home Builders Federation. And I just really wanted to talk a little bit more about the questions on our agenda and how we're going to frame the debate today. We've talked about the ambitions that Greater Manchester, an opportunity Greater Manchester has to really level up and tackle those housing need, homelessness and regional disparities. But this session puts forward the proposition that Greater Manchester can lead the way in recovery. It will dig deep and ask whether more devolved powers and funding are the key to unlocking Greater Manchester's potential, innovation, capability, and build back homes and places in recovery, helping to drive investment in quality, healthy, and sustainable housing. So the big overarching question and I want all of you on the call to be answering and addressing, does Greater Manchester need more devolved powers to deliver truly great homes and places? Well, I think the answer will be a unanimous yes. But there are other things before we get there, and I want all of our our panel and other people just to come and give their perspective of, good practice, what works, but looking at the challenges and barriers that Greater Manchester have in recovery, in terms of providers, landlords and developers from their perspective. As everyone's housing aspirations have changed, I think, what will the future housing market look like, and what powers and kind of investment does Greater Manchester need? And also, I think all that whole point around aspiration is an interesting question these days, as we all sort of recalibrate what we what we want and where we want to live, and what equally where those inequalities are, where not everybody can actually afford to have that choice. But so these are big and interesting in question. I think the increased demand for healthy, sustainable and green homes and places to is really central to this debate as we move forward. And devolution, and I certainly know Andy Burnham talks a lot around the connection between health and housing, and it's something that's very close to my heart. But also I think we will pick up on the next session, which will look at around supported and social care issues, and what Greater Manchester is doing there. So that's sort of the framework, and I'm just going to I'm really delighted that we've got Professor Tony Travers, who is an absolute guru when it comes to governance and local government, but also devolution. So I'm going to ask you, Tony, if you don't mind, to kick off with some thought-provoking thoughts on the big question, but also perhaps just to sort of drill down to what that might look like in reality. And, do we want sort of London-style sort of solutions? And, on the basis, as Tony, as very much Andy Burnham's message, we can do things differently. Wouldn't housing be a good start? And remembering again that collaboration, because we have this sort of commitment from housing providers, the GMH, health and social care providers, and GMCA all coming together to work solidly integrate to get those better houses. So there's lots to talk about today, but that's enough from me, and hopefully get the ball rolling. Over to you, Tony. Thanks.
Okay, Jill, and a very good afternoon to one and all. It's a gloomy afternoon here. I hope it's better where you are. Anyway, or rather November-y out there. So I've been given this opportunity to put down a few thoughts, a few markers really, about where devolution can go to and what this could mean for housing. And I want to first just begin in an obvious place, which is, of course, to say that England within the UK, but it's true of Scotland and Wales as well, and Northern Ireland actually, is they are very centralised. These are very centralised countries. And the UK government governing England, itself a complicated issue, is so centralised, and we all take it for granted because it's what we know. But even in France, I think they'd see Britain or England as a bit centralised, and we used to make, gently and kindly make fun of the centralised nature of France. And certainly Germany, Australia, you name your broadly comparative country, very substantially less centralised. And then when we do have devolution, this being again constitutionless Britain, we end up with a different version of it in Greater Manchester, to the West Midlands, to Greater London. They're all slightly different. And of course, in many other places, including those just outside Greater Manchester, there's no devolution in these terms at all. So once you're into Lancashire or Cheshire, it's classic local government. So it's not only we centralize, but when we try to decentralize or devolve, we end up with a pattern so difficult it's almost impossible to explain it. The best way of looking at these things, by the way, is that a marvelous House of Commons library papers on devolution. And if you want to see the state of the art, that's why I always tell my students to look, because they're very good. Now, Greater Manchester, just worth remembering, has an economy bigger than and a population almost the same size as Wales. So Wales is perfectly able to run itself. I'm from Wales originally, not so far from Manchester, as it happens, where my mother was born. And Wales, is self-governing and more self-governing now even than it was when it was originally set up in 1999. So it's worth remembering is if it can be done in Wales perfectly well, they can run a vaccination program and everything else that a government can do, then why not for Greater Manchester? So I think there's always a need for in any part of England, a sort of greater degree of self-confidence that those of you and those of us who are interested in government, there's absolutely no reason why Greater Manchester, in a way that a major German or Spanish city couldn't have far greater degrees of autonomy, and it would work. It would work. The political system would work in those circumstances. Now, the other thing I'd say, as this is a housing event, I think the greater the possibility of devolving power, the greater it would create a debate in Greater Manchester amongst the leaders of the 10 districts, all those who are involved in housing policies, such as those here gathered, and obviously the Mayor of Greater Manchester, about exactly what housing and where. I mean, obviously that debate takes place at the moment, but it would intensify a greater level of devolution and intensify a discussion about what Greater Manchester was to become. Should it become a much more densely populated city region? Personally, as a city dweller, I think that a higher population and a more densely populated city is good. It provides opportunities to regenerate. It creates more people to use local shops and in fact, more people travel by public transport in cities. That's good for the environment. There's a whole range of reasons why allowing housing to be developed at greater density and at greater numbers would be good for most cities in England, remembering that most cities in England, including London, are not that dense by international standards. So it's just worth remembering that Greater Manchester, Birmingham, the West Midlands city region are not as dense as many equivalent cities elsewhere in Europe. So should there be more devolution? Well, I'm a lifelong believer in less centralization, and actually devolution. Now we have the model, the Greater Manchester model, which is one that's been effectively replicated in other parts of England as first the Cameron, started off as the end of the Blair Brown government, then particularly during the Cameron coalition and through to today. So could we see more devolution? Definitely we could. More powers, but crucially, the thing that has exercised me, and I chaired something for the current Mayor of London and his predecessor, currently the Prime Minister, called the London Finance Commission. And that made recommendations, though it was for London and commissioned for London, we were absolutely explicit. Exactly the same thing could and should be done for Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, Liverpool City region, and so on. And this is a matter of devolving greater control over the range of property taxes, possibly in the longer term over elements of income tax or VAT, and then allowing more powers to be devolved, so more decisions would be made locally. Now, I know Greater Manchester has a form of, I stress a form of, health devolution, rather more actually than is true in London and other city regions other than Greater Manchester. So we can go further with devolution if there's a willingness to do it. Now, Jill mentioned the non-white paper on devolution, which has become a levelling up white paper. And suffice to say, Andy Burnham and others have made it absolutely clear, and I remember hearing him make this point in his acceptance speech after he'd won the mayoral election back in May, that we're not going to get the kind of improvements of economic output, what's now leveling up, better towns, better cities, without devolution. With the best will in the world, civil servants in Whitehall, and I believe civil servants wherever they're based are doing their best, ministers do their best, but the truth is, chances of them making sensitive decisions for Rochdale or for Trafford from their desks wherever they are. Soon some of them will be in Wolverhampton. Well, that might be better for Wolverhampton, but it won't make much difference for people in Greater Manchester. So I think that the more decision making, including over housing, is made at the Greater Manchester and district level, the better for the people of Manchester. Now, Jill referred to the fact that in London, social housing cash, which in the rest of England is normally distributed via Homes England, is actually devolved to the mayor, and therefore the mayor sets housing policies as part of the London plan, with which the boroughs then have to fit their own local plans. Now, whether that model, I'm always very wary about saying anything in London should be done in any other part of England. We're very wary of saying that. But if you just look at it as a model, an idea, so why shouldn't a chunk of the cash that is designed to help build social and affordable housing be devolved to the mayor of Greater Manchester, who with the combined, as part of the combined authority, could then decide how to use it locally. I'm not in any way being disparaging about Homes England. I'm sure do a really good job, but I just think that the more decisions are made locally, the more likely they are to be sensitive to the needs of the people of the 10 districts of Greater Manchester. So that would take me back to what I was saying at the beginning, and I won't go on for too long, is that, all the cities of England, Greater Manchester among them, are different to each other. They have a different history, a different makeup, different scale, but what they have in common is a need for autonomous government where the mayor, council leaders, councillors can, who are actually much more accessible to the public than MPs. MPs are fine, but they do something else, that we would get better decision making. And going back to something I said earlier on, I think it would, the devolution of more power and resources over housing to Greater Manchester would create a debate, which many of the people at this event today would doubtless take part in, about what the city should look like in 20, 25, 30 years. Should it be a city with greater densities? Which parts should have the most development? Should it all be only on ex-industrial land? Are there opportunities to improve housing, which, I know this is very controversial, housing which is life expired? Now, some of my colleagues think no, housing's life expired, but personally, I think some of it is. So we get big opportunities. And then, of course, it would give the city greater opportunity also to entice international investment. A big story in the FT yesterday about how Greater Manchester have been successful, far more than in the past, at enticing international capital into the city. And I think the more the city is seen, Greater Manchester is seen as being able to make its own decisions, the more international funds will go to Manchester in order to have a discussion about how to invest there. Otherwise, they always have to go via some trade show involving civil servants, which is fine. Again, I'm having a go at civil servants. I just think that in a way that Chicago or Barcelona or Munich would be able to make these kind of decisions and on their own, why shouldn't Greater Manchester? So to conclude, I think there's a very, very good argument for the devolution of powers over housing resources, frankly, also over skills. I don't think skills is going to be done well unless it's done at the Greater Manchester level. Health, and of course the great thing about further devolution of housing powers, it makes it far easier for the Greater Manchester and district authorities to tie in transport development and housing development to help, as it were, new homes, new commercial buildings, which in part can then be used to justify and or pay for improved Metrolink services and other expansions to the transport system. So I think it's a very powerful argument for greater devolution, and it comes down to the fact that decisions would be better made locally, and that it would give the economy of Greater Manchester a far better hope in the medium to long term of being able to, and I know these words are heavily used these days with everybody using them differently, level up. Let's just say, let's deconstruct that a bit. It would make it easier to plan for raising the levels of productivity, improving high streets, getting more people living and working and shopping and enjoying themselves in not just Manchester city centre, but in the other 9 districts besides. But I think that's what people want. And I think, therefore, greater devolution would mean higher levels of economic output, better lives for the people of Greater Manchester. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I knew I'd be in firm agreement with everything you said, and I hope everybody, there might be a few other views out there, but I think, absolutely, Greater Manchester's got a terrific opportunity here. I think it's the point around, where is the government on levelling up, and this, I'm beginning to hate the term, because I don't think anybody actually really knows, least of all probably the government, what they actually mean by levelling up. And I think there's always this perennial argument about who's hot and who's cold in number 10, and are things getting, is the reason we still haven't seen the levelling up white paper, but the white paper on devolution just was basically pushed into the long grass. So just a quick one from me, really, Tony. I mean, having worked with our Prime Minister, and I know who rushes up to Manchester and the north to sort of say he wants to level up and build back better and shovel-ready projects and all of those promises. Just wondering, what is the appetite? And I suppose equally, the politics, really. Is it the case that maybe Andy Burnham has been a very good proof of concept mayor, and is therefore quite challenging to that centralised government? Sorry, that's a bit of a deep one for me, but I just, will you indulge me and have a
yeah. And I think there's no question that Andy Burnham has put the office of Mayor of Greater Manchester, therefore the office of directly elected mayor, other than the one other major big city that had one, which was London, has put the whole thing on the map. There's no doubt about that, partly because of the how can I put it delicately, the policy disagreements with the government over aspects of lockdowns and COVID and all of that, but not only for that reason. So I think it's worked. I mean, of course, we have to be wary here, and because in Whitehall, in a sense, the more successful he and other mayors are, Steve Rotherham, I think, has also been pretty successful, actually. The more some people in Whitehall, as you will know, will think, "Oh my goodness, what have we let out here? This alternative power source that can challenge us in our excellent wisdom and decision making." Now, again, I don't want to go overboard on being critical of Whitehall. It's just that personally, I've long thought Whitehall would find it easier to do its job better if it had rather less to do. And I'm struck by an American colleague who came over with some students some years ago now and took them down to the House of Commons for a debate, to watch a debate. They just they had to book it months in advance, so the students turn up from the US and sit in the chamber of the House of Commons, and they are literally, I'm not making this up, watching a debate which is about cattle grids. Okay, cattle grids. So this, as you say, imagine the US Congress spending its time debating cattle grids, and the truth is other legislatures don't do that, and that means that level of burden is placed on Parliament and on Whitehall, and it doesn't matter where the Whitehall is located. It's located there. So I think that it would make Whitehall much more able to do its job better if it had less to do, though they can't help hoarding power. And it would certainly improve the government of Greater Manchester if its mayor, and that you have to ensure that the districts feel that they too are getting something out of this through the combined authority and in other ways, so that they would make decisions better. And at the moment, even planning a roundabout requires Whitehall sanction. Everything requires Whitehall sanction. So I do think Andy Burnham has proved that you can have. I mean, the other thing it's worth making point about Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham, and indeed Peter Soulsby, the Mayor of Leicester, and indeed Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, they all left Parliament for this. And indeed Tracy Brabin has. So they've left Parliament in order to become, and that tells you something about the judgment about where power lies. So they decide that they're going to have more power if they go and become a mayor. Now, question, they don't have that much power. What they do have is legitimacy that comes with election. And I think there's a very good case that the government of Britain would be significantly improved if the Mayor of Greater Manchester and the districts had more of the powers currently residing in Whitehall. One final thought on this one. I know this isn't a very high bar, but we do see opinion polls regularly about trust in various professions. Perhaps predictably, doctors come top, academics don't do too badly, MPs do very badly, but councillors do better than MPs. Now, that's not a very, very high bar, you might say, but there's no doubt that councillors are more trusted than MPs, other things being equal. Why is that? I think it's because people can access them more easily. And you can access the Mayor of Greater Manchester, if you live in Greater Manchester, more easily than you can a cabinet minister, however much the Prime Minister whizzes up and down to be seen in parts of the north of England. The truth is, there's a lot of north of England, there's a lot of England to be in, and you can't be in most of it most of the time. Therefore, somebody who's always present in the city will be more accessible, and people like politicians. In fact, a lot of academic research about devolution. Devolution rarely lifts economic output per head of itself, but what it does do is increase trust in government. It will undoubtedly, if more government is devolved to Greater Manchester, people in the city across the whole of the Greater Manchester area will trust it more than the same powers in the hands of MPs, ministers, and civil servants. Seems to me that's worth it for and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also that ultimate accountability. And I think what happened where Metro Mayors has actually done well, Ben Houchen included, with his free ports and airport, people understood this time what a Metro Mayor can do. And I think there was that feeling that, still, taking on Nicola Sturgeon, that, people are glad to have that voice, and they can actually point to the fact that it is actually worth having more devolved decision making. And I think if Andy Burnham was on the call, I mean, I think the sky's the limit. I mean, it is, but he also says there's so much you can do just right about convening and collaborating. And that's what on housing, that's very much the approach. You can see the problem. How do you bring it? How do we solve it? How do we, without just keep going down to Whitehall and say, yes, sir, we want some money, is to actually really, because you've got devolved powers, you can just get on with the ambition. But it has been hard in Greater Manchester to work out where houses need to go, and there's not necessarily always universal opinion. However, what you have now, as I say, across from health to the housing providers and the GMCA all coming together really for the greater good to come up with something that works for Greater Manchester and the people of Greater Manchester. So there. I wanted just to move over, and Mark, if you're there, Mark Cook from Anthony Collins, who great supporters of Great Homes for Greater Manchester, really to sort of pose the big question, along the line, do we need devolution? As I say, I think that's the answer is yes. But from a Greater Manchester perspective, what are the challenges, and what's the view from the street, as it were? But your comments, please, Mark.
Yeah, well, I think the issue is not just devolution of powers, but devolution of power, which was a point which Tony was making, really, because you can list a load of powers which would be good for local authorities, combined authority to have. But in fact, they do have a lot of powers already. Basically, the combined authority has a lot of the powers of Homes England, just not the funding, for example. The key issue for me is there's a whole load of functions of local government which are subject to the consent of the Secretary of State. For example, disposal of housing land, or provision of financial assistance to providers of housing accommodation other than council housing. But they're subject to the consent of the Secretary of State, who normally will publish then a load of general consents. Well, why can't that consent be devolved to the mayor? And by the way, that's something not even happening in London, but if we're going to really operate things, giving the government less to do, which is what Tony has been talking about, actually means taking away power, real power, because they have this requirement of reserve powers being held by them because they don't trust local government fundamentally. There's something in that central lock which parties or governments of all complexions have got. And I would very much like to look at the extent to which those kind of powers can be devolved. The other area where I think actually combined authorities could do more and become the prime decider is in the planning system. So again, a lot of stuff has to go to central government to approve in terms of Secretary of State. I think we should be radical and say to what extent in combined authority areas are those decisions actually based at the heart of the combined authority and the mayor alongside local authority. It never has to go back to Marsham Street or Wolverhampton, as it will be soon, for decision making, really. It's not necessary. And if we're going to do what Tony said in terms of densities of cities and other things which other cities do, then there's a much more bigger question in my mind, which is cutting the powers of the Minister or the Secretary of State for housing, local communities and local government, to the extent where then we can say it becomes very much a residual department rather than the prime department for driving policy, which is ultimately about how communities and local authorities thrive. So I would dream for something radical on the basis that if you ask for something radical, you might get something in between, and so that's what I'd like to raise by way of debate.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really valid point, given the scale of the challenge with the ahead above however many, is it 100 and so many thousands, and in Greater Manchester, where are those houses going to go? Where are they going to plan? What kind of accommodation? How can you scale up green housing? All of those things. I mean, it's always going to make enormous sense to make the decision-making process quicker. But the planning white paper was a bit of a disaster in many ways, because the whole idea there was to, we had a big session on permitted development rights, or, what kind of properties were going to, turning offices into housing, or various bits of land. So not necessarily places where people do want to live. So I think that whole thing around joining up, collaborating, but it has to be surely not something for Whitehall to worry about. And I think it's a really fascinating discussion, because, and I always think that you should ask for the moon and you might get the stars. And I think, and it's in the words of Michael Heseltine, who also comes to our Liverpool City Regional Party Parliamentary Group, and is a big fan of Steve Rotherham from ages old, and the work that he's done in Merseyside. But he says, you're not being bold enough. You've got to be more bold. Don't ask for permission. Get on with it, and and wait for them to tell you to stop. And I agree with that. Tony, you look like
no, I was just totally agreeing with what you and indeed what Mark was saying, because I think there is we have to be a bit sort of open about this. I've long thought that I'm a pro, I think, in favor of devolution and decentralization and more local decision making. I know that deep down many local authorities kind of, they don't quite think it through like this, half like being dependent on the centre, because it gives them plausible deniability. They can blame, say, we can't do this because they won't give us the powers. We can't decide this because we have to get the money in a little pot from Whitehall. So, the other side of this is that local government does have to want this, and the downside that comes with it, which is, if you look at Scotland and Wales, in each case, Scotland and Wales now have had to set up mechanisms to think about how they build up the local, or their case, the national tax base, because they rely in part on their own income tax and other resources. So they've got to think now, not just that the UK tax base will pay for it, but our tax base in Scotland and Wales will have to pay for things. So we need to look after it. So I think that, in a sense, confronting local politicians with the need to end up making more decisions, some of which won't be very popular, but I absolutely agree about call-in powers and consent powers. I mean, it is just, trying to find nice words for this, not sensible. And I detect that, by the way, in London, that the Secretary of State is becoming more activist on call-ins. Well, now you've got 3 levels of government making planning decisions, and that's if you don't have a neighbourhood level. So there are no good words to describe this. I mean, I definitely think the buck should stop at the city regional mayor, exactly as Mark has said. I think that would make a lot of sense, and it would concentrate an argument about, as I say, I personally think, by the way, that and you're right, that the government's planning proposals have got into, just step from one disaster to another politically. But actually, there's a great opportunity for Greater Manchester, because I think there's more, I know it's never easy, but more of an appetite for densification, building more housing in Greater Manchester than there is in leafy Berkshire and Surrey. Well, QED, let's try and take advantage of that from the government's point of view and build more in the cities that want more homes. I mean, I know it's not that simple, because but I think that more people, let's put it the other way around. I think fewer people are going to fight hard to stop any building near them in Greater Manchester than in many of the counties where they will do that.
I think that's an interesting point as well, on the cities and towns debate, as we sort of are, in many ways, our orbits and mobilities are more localized, and our trips to London or trips to even the centres of city regions are less. Then the towns fund, that whole process of regeneration and building back, again, little pockets of money. But the bigger piece, I think, in this keys to recover is how we do live, work, rest, and play, and how our relationship and choices have changed. Will we all quickly bounce back into working at institutions, offices, blocks, and whatever, or what is the lasting impact? I know it's moving slightly off devolution, but I think it's relevant because, cities being sort of the generators of, and probably still will be, once we get the play bits like football games and theatre and, restaurants all opening up, and there'll be a desire to do that. But there's a much bigger thing around where, if we are going to level up, how do you level up? Where are the places of inter and intra-regional disparities that we need to tackle? And I think that's quite interesting. Okay, Mark, did you have anything to come back on? And I'm going to bring in Hannah Roberts, who's a councillor in Oldham and a regular on the call.
I'll let Hannah speak, to be honest, because I can then jump in after that. Yeah.
So Hannah's been very controversial. She's saying,
go for it.
Sorry, but you are wrong about opposition to building homes or anything else that matter. Everyone agrees in principle they support brownfield development, but too often that translates into, I didn't mean that brownfield site. So Hannah, nice to see you again. Yeah.
Hello. had a haircut, I think, since I was last here.
Good. Very nice.
So I think it's interesting, really, because clearly we're kind of like the other end of the devolution thing. So the conversation so far has been very much about well, what kind of powers should excuse me, the metro mayors have. And I think it's interesting in terms of what that means then for lower tiers of local authorities, because while I'd be quite happy to have Andy Burnham making decisions that currently get made in Whitehall for us, you know, about compulsory purchase orders and whether or not we can have a registered landlord scheme across the whole borough, no idea why the Secretary of State needs to make that decision. I think there are issues then about what the relationship starts to be between the local authorities and the you know, conurbation or mayoral area, because they're not all metro, are they? And I think, you know, nothing irritates me more than being called a district by staff at the GMCA. You know, Oldham is not a district, it's a local authority, it's a place in its own right. And there's something about the way that we get referred to that I really don't like. And I think that we need a clear understanding, I think, about what the things are that we do better together and what the things are that we do better for ourselves, because all of the arguments that apply as to why it's better for Greater Manchester to make its own decisions for Greater Manchester equally apply as to why it's better for Oldham or Trafford or Tameside to make its own decisions for the things that affect us and our residents. And I think that the whole GMSF now places for everyone debacle has been an absolute illustration of what some of the issues can be, and that what can look like a really easy decision if you're in Manchester or Salford is a very difficult decision if you're in Oldham with very little land that's available for building. And you know, we've had to make some really difficult decisions about allocation of greenbelt sites. So you know, and that goes back to a wider argument then about, well, why is the government deciding how many homes we need on out-of-date data and all the rest of it? And actually, we haven't been able, even as Greater Manchester, to influence what those kinds of allocations have been. So despite, you know, repeated lobbying and insistence, we're still making decisions based on 2014 data, which is now woefully out of date after Brexit and now after the last, you know, the last 18 months in terms of the kind of housing that people want and where they want to live. But, you know, despite our very best collective Greater Manchester efforts, we've not been able to make the government change its mind. So I just think that, you know, when you're looking at this, you need to kind of think about making sure that Greater Manchester or, you know, the Liverpool region doesn't end up becoming a substitute for how people feel about Whitehall.
I quite agree.
Interesting point. Mark, did you want to come back on
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And indeed, many years ago, I knew a new MP who was one of David Cameron's A-listers, so I thought I'd go and have a cup of tea with her. And she said at the time that there was a group of newcomers along into the government at that point who were very keen to ensure that when powers devolved to one level, another level of power should also be granted to the next level onwards, basically, so that there was not any power seizing that way. Now, I've never seen any real evidence of that momentum, that aspiration actually being brought into fruition, basically. Although, you know, things have moved on since then in many ways, and things are slightly better. But the key test is who is best able to make the decision for the benefit of the local area, and so necessarily, obviously, local authorities who've been around a lot longer than regional authorities, for crying out loud, should be able to actually produce their own list of what they would require or like to be able to decide at their local level, because then when they've got more autonomy, then they are forced even more to work in collaboration with each other to make sure that actually the outturn and benefits are better for the region. So it flips upwards as well as downwards if you begin to do that properly.
Absolutely. Tony, did you have a...
Well, I mean, as I said, I'm strongly in favour of powers being devolved as locally as possible. So I certainly mean, to Oldham as well as to Greater Manchester. But coming back to something Mark said, and forgive me, this is not my view. I'm just going to give you something I've learned, and you all know, everybody here knows this, that ministers and civil servants of any party in government just, for some reason, don't trust local government. They somehow think it's all like the worst example of itself in a way that's not seen as true elsewhere. It is definitely seen as true in local government. And in that sense, the coming of combined authorities and city regional mayors, because they're new and they're often headed by, in the case of Andy Burnham, a former cabinet minister, I think it makes it a little bit more difficult to argue that they shouldn't be given more power. Now, it is not, I don't see local government like this. I'd have some departments of Whitehall in special measures, and there are plenty of them actually. And you only have to read the National Audit Office's reports on Whitehall departments to see they themselves are not very good at doing things. But we do have to get over this profound belief in Whitehall amongst civil servants and ministers that they genuinely know best. They know better for Oldham than you do, they think. Now, I know that's insulting and I don't agree with it, but I'm afraid that, well, even if they wouldn't say it quite like that, privately, they would think it. So I absolutely take your point about not stopping devolution, at the combined authority and the mayor, but because it's new-ish, I think there is an opportunity there to devolve some power to that level. Not forgetting that means devolution to within Greater Manchester. So I'm on your side, just wary of the belief systems in the core of government.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm glad that Hannah's on the call as always, because she always says it like it is. The view from Oldham is very well represented by Hannah. I'd like to open up the discussion, and so we're not all in violent agreement. I'm all saying yes, we want more powers, but really looking at the reality. If we can look, this series around the keys to recovery, and I suppose what we're saying is we think the devolution is very much part of the key, and how we unlock better housing and better places, and ultimately Great Homes to Greater Manchester is about making that case, not just with the GMCA, but also helping the GMCA, Andy Burnham and Paul Dennett in particular, to say, right, we have got a plan, this is what we want to achieve. Hannah's right to point out the issues around places for the GMSF and now places for everyone, which we, as I say, I think we will certainly be doing a session on that, as our sort of finale to this series. But I just really want to open it up, and I know there's a couple of people I'm on the line that I'd like to hear from, and you might say no, I don't want to speak, but Frank Carolan, I'm calling you out. Put your camera on. For example, from Stockport, Stockport Homes. I'd like to hear from a housing provider's perspective. We've also got Joe Breen from the Northern Housing Consortium, which has obviously got a pan-Northern, done so much really on the debate. So I'm just wondering, would you like to make a short contribution or anything, Frank, if you've not fallen asleep, which you can't have because the debate's been so interesting. No? Oh, and indeed anybody else who wants to take part, but I thought those are two good ones. If not, Yeah, Joe Breen, come on in.
I'm happy to have a quick word if that's okay. Thank you.
Lovely. I know you've missed some of it, but
yeah, apologies. I came in during the latter half of this, but I mean, irrespective of the debate, we're at the Northern Housing Consortium. We're definitely interested in the kind of dynamics that exist within northern regions, and naturally, devolution is something that has been raised all across the north, and we're very interested in seeing what housing opportunities lie within devolution for Manchester in particular, considering we have quite a few members who are very much invested, I suppose, in developing Manchester more and creating more housing there. And I think, like so many people have kind of iterated, devolution will play a massively important process in terms of a part in terms of the process of building up and leveling up Manchester some more, in a way that may be unprecedented. But from the Northern Housing Consortium's point of view, if there's any support that we can kind of give in influencing government to press more powers for Greater Manchester, then we're more than happy to.
Yeah, well, it's good. I mean, we talk regularly, so we're always grateful for your support. Donna, you turned your camera on. I'm rather hoping that you would like to give a view from the housing providers sort of perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised housing isn't usually backward in coming forward, is it? So I really just like to build on Hannah's point. I mean, I think for us as housing providers, it's about working very closely with our local authority partners. And in fact, yesterday in Oldham, we did hold a joint seminar with the leadership teams of both our housing association and ONBC. And I think that was about having a conversation about how can we work together most effectively as we come out of the pandemic, because the reality is a lot of the challenges that Oldham was grappling with were there before the pandemic, and they've just been magnified by the pandemic. So really, I think it's incumbent on all of us to work together and use that combined effort and our resources and energies to get the best result for our communities. So, just completely support what's being said. And, I think on behalf of most of the housing associations working in the Northwest, we're keen to work with our local authority partners, and any way we can bring some of that decision making and into the local area where the insight and the understanding and knowledge is actually exists. I think that'd be very welcome.
Absolutely. Good. And I think we should also remember one of the other big ambitions, and that's really around, I mean, the point you made is that the problems pre-pandemic are still there. They haven't gone away, but I would say they've been slightly recalibrated. But equally, the other thing is the inequalities within our housing have been so heightened. But there's, things like, Bed Every Night, Everyone In have been very popular on the homelessness front as well. And we'll be looking at that at the next session as well. But the key thing here, I think, is as we recalibrate our thinking is that, ambition of Andy Burnham's for 50,000 truly affordable homes. As always, ever since I've worked in housing, which is many moons now from my days with Nick Rainsford, if anybody remembers him, forever talking about, affordability. And I think that how devolution can actually do something differently to sort of reconfigure the housing market and actually go back to that word I used at the beginning around aspiration, because I think they have changed, is an interesting one. How that actually, how do you take, Tony, ambitions and big, gesture statements? I'm not being critical of Andy, I wouldn't dream of it. But, I think just as the government have too difficult you know, I think, you know, homelessness and affordability have been too difficult for whoever's in power to actually deliver the number of houses, the quality of housing, you know, where you want to live. And I think I'm interested in that recalibration and really how, you know, we've talked about planning, and, you know, it makes an awful lot of sense for those powers not to be in Whitehall. But how can we really use this moment and use devolution as sort of the mechanism to, you know, meet some of those grand gesture statements of affordability, you know, healthy, quality, you know, aspirational, transformational living that we all probably want, bearing in mind that things have changed. Oh, you're on mute.
I switched it off. Well, I switched off while I was doing a bit of research. I'm not sorry. I didn't really hear clack clack as I was typing away. I mean, it has changed things. There's no doubt that you know, even if only a small proportion of the population living in cities who currently own homes sort of want to get a bit more space, that means a bit less space in total for everybody else. It's a mathematical certainty. So that's changed. I think the two other things have changed actually of profound importance to Greater Manchester and particularly to the city centre. One is we just don't know what's going to happen to town centres, but particularly to big city centres. We just don't know what's going to happen to the messaging about people going back to work. Because, you know, one of the big changes in the Greater Manchester city centre economy in the last 20 or 30 years is the way it had revived. People had moved back into or moved into the city centre for the first time in larger numbers. And at the moment, UK national government shows no particular sense of whether it is going to encourage people to go back to work by reversing the messaging it put in place last year, or just see what happens, a sort of Doris Day, que sera, sera, you know, what will be approach. And, you know, if I ran a small business in a town or city centre and I thought people were not going to go back to work there because of a pandemic that wasn't my fault, which it wasn't anybody's fault, well, you know, then I think I'd feel in terms of all my business decisions have been altered without me having any say in it. So I think that things may change. And by the way, Ben Houchen was mentioned. He's been a great mayor for Teesside, but the truth is his model is a bit different to the Greater Manchester idea. He believes in smaller towns. His area, by the way, you know, has a very different configuration. And so that's another thing. If government public policy and all the little pots of money like the Towns Fund all become focused on smaller towns, that's not great for any of the bigger cities. And the model that was previously in place for Manchester, Greater Manchester, and Birmingham, West Midlands, and so on, and London. So I think we are in a moment where this debate needs to take place. So to put it crudely, were all our planning assumptions that we had for Greater Manchester January last year still the right ones today? Discuss.
Yeah. And just harping back to actually probably this time last year when we probably held our first session like this online, and I think we were all pretty raw, weren't we, in terms of understanding where we actually were. I'm not mentioning any names, but I can. But somebody from the GMCA sort of was fairly stoic. And I'm not going to quote him because I think in hindsight, but he said, we've done it before, we can do it again. And that was regarding the 2008 crash. And I thought, well, there isn't, you can't compare 2008 with something which we don't know how it's going to pan out. So I think there was that sort of like initial approach to say we've still got to build 119,000 homes, whatever it is, to that sort of thing that we hadn't actually fathomed the depths of the pandemic and what that would ultimately mean. Equally, going forward, you know, we can still say, well, things haven't changed, but this is a huge opportunity, and I think that's a really valid point. I think this is very thought-provoking, indeed. I'm going to bring in Hannah's got her hand up. Hannah, yeah.
So I might not be the best person to comment on this, especially after my remarks about Oldham. But I do think my understanding is that there are already starting to be some questions about the kind of continuing extent of the market for apartments in Manchester city centre and Salford city centre, even before the pandemic begun. But clearly there are a lot more questions now about what the housing market should look like and what people's choices are. I'm not the best place to comment about that, because clearly it's not, it's not my area. But equally, in Oldham, we have put our eggs in the town centre basket, even though it's a much smaller town centre, in order to be able to save our greenbelt. So, all of these things matter, sometimes on a bigger scale and sometimes on a smaller scale for us. And I can't help thinking that some of the answer to all of this is about what we think housing should look like. I got laughed at 2 years ago, and I said that we should start building car-free housing. And I said that for several reasons, not just because it helps with all of the green stuff, but the amount of space that we put aside for putting cars on and for parking, that we could be doing something else with. It could be somebody's open space, or it could be somebody else's home. It just seems to me that we need to think really carefully about what we want to do with the land that we have and what we think that the future should look like. But the trouble, I suppose, we have with all of this is that electoral cycles and people's political priorities are very short term, actually, and trying to get people to think about it's the same with all the whole climate change argument, isn't it? So trying to get people to think about what the long-term impact of what we do now will have in 5-10 years time is a really hard thing to do. And to get people to think that they might want to live in something that is not a small house. I mean, you can tell I don't come from Oldham, I come from London, and people have very different views about where they want to live. People are happy to live in a good quality flat in London. That's not the case in a lot of Oldham. I don't know if it's the same in the rest of Greater Manchester, but that's not what people's aspiration is for their home. And I kind of think that unless we can start to show people that they can meet their aspirations for their family, they can get about the conurbation without a car, they can do all of those other things, that we're going to be stuck in this kind of thing of building homes which are not, long-term, life-term homes for people. They're not, they don't meet the climate agenda that we need to have, and so on. But I think that's a really big shift, although equally, I suppose, the shift of people wanting a lot more space and wanting different kinds of homes, if work's going to be different, might help us to do that and might show people that it is possible to do something different. But I kind of think those kind of hearts and minds things are as important as us having a great strategic plan for where we want to put houses.
Yeah, well, I think that's...
I just agree, Jill. I totally agree with Hannah's point. I mean, I think, I vaguely remember when CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, existed. They'd occasionally do polling as to what people's favourite form of housing was, and slightly to the shock of all the grandee architects and designers there, the bungalow tended to win quite a lot. And the truth is that town centre and city centre living can be much better for the environment. And I think because people don't have to travel as much and they can walk more and they don't have to use cars as much, and I think there is a risk with the pandemic in a number of cities, including Greater Manchester, but sprawl could be one of the consequences. If everybody decides to move out a bit and to work from home a bit more, and not to go into the city centre a bit more, you're taking yourself on a route to Los Angeles, not to Hong Kong, as it were, or Paris. And these are really interesting debates to begin to be having. I totally agree.
Well, I don't want Greater Manchester to be Los Angeles, I don't think, but but very good point. I think I'm going to bring in the mighty James Stevens from the Home Builders Federation, because I know you've only just crept on the call, and obviously the topic is around more powers. We've covered a lot of ground, but just picking up on Hannah's point about aspirations and how we will live, work and rest in place. We also have talked about planning, having more powers which are not centralized by government and regs, but centralized decision making. So just a few comments from you, James, if you don't mind, about some of from your perspective, the challenges that home builders are facing in Greater Manchester and beyond.
Thank you very much, Jill, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm sorry I'm late to the meeting, but I was in a meeting with the Cornwall Combined Authority discussing their housing crisis down there, and they've got a major housing crisis fueled by relatively affluent incomers and not enough homes for local people that they can afford, because it's a low-income economy. Plus the fact that a lot of existing landlords are now converting their homes to Airbnb and holiday opportunities. They've got a severe crisis there, and but they are meeting their affordable housing targets. They've got quite strong affordable housing targets, and house builders are prepared to meet those. And that's one of the issues that I put to Mayor Burnham and his deputy mayor Paul Dennett. Is I said, take a leaf out of the book of what they're doing in London, and actually have a spatial strategy that actually sets some quite ambitious, quite demanding affordable housing targets, and sit behind the authority of your plan. The problem is, planning amongst the political class at the moment, plan making is extremely unpopular. They like development management, the ability really to say no, but they really don't like to do plan making. And I would take issue with Hannah's point. I'm sorry, I haven't heard the others, but Hannah's point about a grand spatial plan not being essential. I wouldn't mind if we just produced 9 local plans for Greater Manchester, but the problem is that those 10 local authorities of Greater Manchester are using the promise of the spatial development strategy as an excuse not to update their local plans. And local plans are very important, not only because they allocate land. That's extremely important to the house building industry. It's extremely difficult to get a planning permission unless you have an allocation. So they have a vital role in that respect. But it also enables Andy Burnham and Paul Dennett and the leaders of the respective local authorities to put their stamp on what they want Greater Manchester to be, and kind of what their top priorities are for planning, not just housing, but other objectives as well. But I've kind of become exhausted with making that argument now in Greater Manchester. I kind of now think that Andy Burnham isn't interested in the spatial strategy. I think Paul Dennett is valiantly battling to try and bring it forward, but I've kind of given up that argument, and I actually now want the 10 local authorities to at least do something. I think it's unfortunate. I didn't think we needed to be in this position. I've long argued that the government needs to devolve more powers to the combined authorities, including Greater Manchester, and to give them the same powers that Sadiq Khan and Boris Johnson and Ken Livingstone had in London, which in terms of plan making was highly successful. They've produced at least 5 spatial plans for London over the last 15 years. Is it, Tony? 15, 20 years that the Greater London Authority has been in operation. Yeah. And those plans have been very effective. It's a very effective model. I have major disagreements with aspects of policy, but it has been an extremely effective way of planning for London's overall needs amongst the 33 boroughs. They would never have delivered the infrastructure and the housing, although the housing lags significantly behind what the need is, but nevertheless it has driven up housing supply and coordinated that with infrastructure, which 33 or 35 now, 33 London boroughs would never have done working on their own. So I think Andy Burnham, even though I've grown exhausted with making this case, and I'm boring everybody about it. I think Andy Burnham should actually recognise that the spatial strategy for Manchester is his way of putting his stamp on Manchester, both with his addressing affordable housing needs, addressing homelessness, addressing the environment, coordinating major new infrastructure delivery like HS2, and delivering his town centre challenge. And I do agree with you. I'm somebody who lives on the Old Kent Road in London. I love living in the centre of cities, and and I think there is a very big future for the town centres of Greater Manchester.
Okay, thanks. I mean, Hannah, I know you probably didn't agree with that, and not all of it. And I'm going to.
Well, some of it's. I just want to say, I mean, we've just yesterday launched consultation on the issues and options for our local plan. We're not reluctant to do a local plan. We're getting on with it. So, and the reason why it's been delayed is because of all of the delays that there have been to the GMSF. But we're getting on with it, and our issues and options consultation is now open. We will have a local plan. So that's what I was making a face at. And I think you misunderstood what I was saying. I wasn't saying that we shouldn't plan. I do think we should plan. And I really do hope that Places for Everyone comes to fruition. I mean, the joint committee meeting was on the 20th of July. And that, we're able to move forward. What I was saying was that of itself, having a strategic plan isn't enough in terms of what kind of place that people want to live in. And we need to think more about some of the detail, which is a local plan issue, as much as we do the spatial stuff. That's what I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point around the Places for Everyone, which is basically the 9 out of the 10 coming together, as I understand, as I said, that will be one of the things that we'll be at the end of the series. We'll have Paul Dennett at this session to look at that. I mean, it's James, it's not been easy. I don't think it's from want of trying, and it's just, again, the point of this session to say you really do need to unlock housing and get it working and make sure you're meeting the aspirations in, which is essentially a new context, but also still the same, because we still need, ultimately we need more homes, and we need those homes to be affordable, and now they need to be healthy and green as well. So the how we plan for the future is essential. And I think what we were talking about earlier, that it does make sense to have more local decision making and input, and it doesn't make sense for targets to be set from Whitehall in Surrey. So Tony, hi.
Yeah, and I agree with James's point. I think just having something written down, I mean, as with, it's like going to a meeting, and if you've got a piece of paper, you can have an argument about the piece of paper as what's written on the piece of paper rather than the piece of paper. And I think the point about having a city regional plan of broadly what's going to happen, and starting to iron out the disagreements and have the arguments actually, because there need to be arguments about how many homes go where. And in having the argument, politicians ought to use their skills of persuasion in some cases to convince the public that something the public don't want will be good for them. And I think having something written down as a plan is always a way of beginning to articulate such a debate. I know that there's always a risk that then the boroughs and the citywide authority have an argument, but that's also part of politics. And politicians having arguments, providing they're nicely done, is great, because that's what politics is about.
I think there's a point there, isn't there, about having a plan, but also how the plan delivers the ambition. And I think maybe it's Hannah or Tony, the point that, often manifestos and promises and ambitions are made in the next minute. We've got a very volatile political scenario at the moment. And, then we end up with targets and plans being changed, or and I think it's an interesting conundrum. I think it's the same with climate change. It's been on fuel poverty and so many targets over the every successive governments. And I think, you know, that's the difference surely when you have a metro mayor where that is sort of collaborating and trying to bring everybody together to sort of say, well, this is our plan. It's not an imposed plan. And the reason it's our plan is that we feel we brought everybody with us and we're happy about it. But that has been getting everybody to agree, you know, is always difficult. We've got a better chance of it in Greater Manchester, I think. And there is that huge potential. I don't know, Mark, did you want to come back? And if there's anybody else who wanted to come back on any of the points made.
I think your point about collaboration is very important, because I think that a whole lot of behaviours have been relearnt during the pandemic, which have involved collaboration. It's a danger that as we come out of pandemic, at a variety of levels of society, we lose those behaviours. And I think that when it comes to people's places and homes, there's no doubt that things are changing. And I talk to clients about what they are planning in terms of coming back in the office, and people are likely to come back 1 or 2 days a week, not more than that. And their whole dynamic about where people choose to live will require a different approach. That means that, yes, we do want plans so that we make sure that things don't change too much, but we also have to be more flexible about adapting to change, which is fast paced at the moment with new technology and the like coming through. So whatever plan we have has to have a plan where we can understand how we are going to change things in the course of the plan. And I think that rigidity, which has been historic in relationship between central government and locality, has to be something which becomes much more flexible and capable of being at the behest of the locality and local government, rather than the government saying, we're going to publish another sort of fund which you're going to bid, and it's called Levelling Up, so therefore let's go for that one, and the next one will be called something else, basically. But it's all about chasing money, whereas actually giving autonomy locally creates more opportunity to adapt flexibility within the overall parameters of what people are trying to do. And I do think collaborative behaviours, such as those highlighted by James, will be essential for taking things forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe, come on in from Northern Housing Consortium.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would definitely follow up with agreeing with that whole kind of eminent spirit of collaboration. I think that has been vital in kind of how we've operated as an organization. I mean, naturally, it's a different dynamic altogether, but if you have that, we often deal with organizations and members that have a great deal of autonomy, and as long as there's that overarching theme of we're going to do this collectively and we're going to reinforce this, and there's also an air of trying to clear the air on any problems, like Tony mentioned, people have with certain pathways of development and things like that. Yeah, we definitely reinforce that. And I think on the point of questions around, you know, whether Greater Manchester or other cities around the region will face kind of a distinct lack of custom and of people coming into city centres and things like that, we've seen a relatively mixed image, I would say. I mean, we have a lot of members who are based in, say, Liverpool or Sunderland and Newcastle, who are all developing kind of the city centre kind of area. I think a core thing for Manchester that might definitely help it recover post-COVID is evidently the fact that so many civil servants are based around the region, and there is looking to be a distinct amount of encouragement from the government departments to continue working in office, especially with you know, ministries that are prominent in Manchester, like DWP and the Home Office, which require you to handle, you know, confidential information and classified data and things like that inside an office confine. So I think to a certain extent, there'll probably be quite a lot of people going into Manchester city centre and looking to buy a Manchester city centre, and that's definitely a good benefit that the region has. And yeah, again, I would just echo the spirit of collaboration thing would definitely be something I would advise that would work on a local authority to provider basis, because it has for us when we've tried to demystify energy efficiency or MMC or any other alternatives like that, where people have been a little bit skeptical going into it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I'm just going to sort of finish up really, unless anybody's got anything other to add. Just a few quick thoughts that one size doesn't fit all. I think we've had that point. It's ridiculous that roundabouts are decided upon in Whitehall. If we don't look out, Greater Manchester will end up with a sprawl like Los Angeles, but at least we'll get some better weather in Greater Manchester, depending on climate change, I suppose. I think the key thing is that we do need a plan, and we do need those ambitions. I think the collaboration that we have in Greater Manchester is there, and it is its strength. And this is very much around building the sense of place. And I think, we talk about bricks and mortar or MMC these days, or how are we going to build those houses? But it's not. It's how we do live, work, rest and play, and how that all connects, and where we do want to live and can afford to live, and those choices. I think it's an amazing opportunity, I think, for Andy Burnham and Greater Manchester and the housing providers, deliverers and providers to really to get together and behind that to say, yeah, we can build and create better communities and places and vibrant local economies, which will actually unlock our economies and get us back on the road to work and recovery. It's an exciting time as we all reflect on the last year or 15 months or 16 months. I'm a firm believer that it's not over yet. So I'm just going to go back to the beginning. I'm going to ask perhaps Mark and Tony, just maybe Mark and then Tony, to give some final thoughts on where next in terms of recovery and getting those local economies working, and how important housing and homes and places are in that equation. So Mark.
Housing is important for two reasons. It's important for lots of reasons, but these two just come to mind in relation to this context. One is that building homes and maintaining homes creates jobs in itself, and that's something vital, and therefore we need to work hard to basically develop the skills to do so, and a lot more coordination could happen at a Greater Manchester level to achieve that. And the second one is that homes also are places which create communities, and I think the question we have to ask with all the changes happening, partly because of the pandemic, is where do we need to intentionally create the communities? In other words, particularly in the central areas, many neighbourhoods have clear identities. What new identities do we have to create, and what governance do we put in place to enable people to have a sense of combined connection?
Yeah, I think that's good, very good. And finally, Tony.
Right, well, great and fascinating discussion. I do think, and I think we'll all agree on this, I hope, that any discussion about housing numbers, the type of housing to be built and where it's built, is going to be done better nearer to where people currently live and have run their businesses than by people from a long way away, if I can put it in that rather Lady Bird books way. And that's what we're here to, that's what I think we will agree on that. Actually, there is a substantial need for more housing across Britain than there will be for years to come. And although I realise there's opportunity to development everywhere, I still think that people in cities kind of get that they need more housing, more infrastructure, more hardware, more easily than people in the leafier areas that surround those cities. So I think there is a real opportunity here for Greater Manchester, and having a plan, going back to that idea, is the basis of having a debate about what the whole thing should look like. right across the 450 square miles of Greater Manchester, there's an argument to be had about what goes where, what kind of Oldham we want, what kind of traffic we want, and so on, and what should come out of all of this, what the city centre should be like, what the airport, all of these things. And I just think having a debate about that the public can to some degree engage in, even if they want to argue against it, is noble work.
So thank you very much indeed. I think it's really been thought-provoking. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for everybody who's made a contribution and been with us today. They are coming, the next in the series, which was moved, but very, very important, is how can we build back better social care and supported housing in Greater Manchester, and that is actually on Monday. Again, will be a really fascinating session to look at another too hard problem and another sort of delay from government on what to do about social care, but also, the growth in the need for supported housing and how we actually can do something in Greater Manchester, which is probably different, but also meets there is going to be a growing demand post-pandemic for care and supported housing. We're yet to see the actual impact and consequences, I think, or long-term impact of how that's impacted on, mental health and various, logjams, that have arisen. So yeah, we've seen that in the pandemic. So that's going to be a really good session. I'll make sure that you're all invited and come along. And the finale is, we've just heard from the GMCM, Paul Dennett, that we will be holding this session around places for everyone and delivery, because that is, I think it's due to go out for consultation on the 9th of August. So it'll either be before or after or around that time. So I will see you, hopefully some of you soon. Thank you very much, everybody, Mark, James, and particularly Tony, but of course Hannah, and everyone else who's been on the call, and Joe and everyone. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully see you soon. All right, bye for now.
Bye all. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.